This year, I became one of the judges at the Dev Talk Spooktober Game Jam, one of the largest visual novel game jams ever, with hundreds of devs competing for a prize pool of, that year, over $8,000. Teams had 1 month to finish a visual novel, and every year some great visual novels come out of this competition. But after judging 210 entries, the judges and I noticed some pitfalls that kept some games from hitting their full potential. So I made a list of 7 lessons that apply not just to game jams, but for any visual novel you're working on. Lesson 1, don't bury the lead. Don't save the hook of your game for later. Start with it and build it up from there. For larger games, that's worth keeping in mind at the inception of your visual novel projects. Find out what the hook of your game is and lean into it. If your game is about romance, get to the romance. If your game is a death game, kill someone first thing, like Danganronpa did, dummy. That's fun, people like that. Opening cinematics and cutscenes can often be enough to buy you some time before you get to the meat of your story, but don't expect your readers to be patient while you set up the dominoes. They want to be entertained throughout, not just wowed by how you made the story threads come together. Most, if not all, the games I played were intended to be spooky, but it took a few of them a long time to get there. If I'm reading for 20 minutes and this supposedly scary visual novel is, I don't know, just about kids talking on their first day of school, I'm going to start wondering if this game is going to fulfill its promises to me as a reader. One of the better Spooktober entries, Replaced, literally started with the premise that Reapers are attracted to death, and this Reaper feels there's death nearby. So from the get-go, there's an implication someone was dead. The writer earned the time to do a bunch of character building because we knew someone was about to die or about to find a body, and that was some suspense by the Hitchcockian definition. In an interview, Alfred Hitchcock explained this. There is a distinct difference between suspense and surprise, and yet many pictures continually confuse the two. I'll explain what I mean. We're now having a very innocent little chat. Let's suppose that there is a bomb underneath this table between us. Nothing happens, and then all of a sudden, boom, there is an explosion. The public is surprised, but prior to this surprise, it is seen an absolutely ordinary scene of no special consequence. Now, let us take a suspense situation. The bomb is underneath the table and the public knows it, probably because they've seen the anarchists place it there. The public is aware the bomb is going to explode at 1 o'clock, and there is a clock in the decor. The public can see that it is 1:45. In these conditions, the same innocuous conversation becomes fascinating because the public is participating in the scene. The audience is longing to warn the characters on the screen, you shouldn't be talking about such trivial matters, there's a bomb beneath you and it's about to explode. In the first case, we have given the public 15 seconds of surprise at the moment of explosion. In the second, we have provided them with 15 minutes of suspense. The conclusion is that whenever possible, the public must be informed. Except when the surprise is a twist, that is, when the unexpected ending is, in itself, the highlight of the story. The Spooktober judges don't really pay attention to the marketing materials, so even if the game has screenshots of a scary monster, the marketing copy says there's a monster, and the game is called "This Game Has a Scary Monster in It," but the game itself just doesn't seem like it has a monster for a while, that's not really enough to build suspense or even partially fulfill my expectations as a reader, because it's missing another really important element. Lesson 2. Build your atmosphere. With a visual novel, you want to elicit emotions in your reader. And you can't do that just by telling them, hey, you should be sad about now, this is a sad scene. You have to coax them into feeling that way. And atmosphere is a huge part of that. Try focusing on something small in the environment you've created that primes them for the general tonality of a scene. If you're setting a scene in a classroom, focus on the dull ticking of a clock and the sporadic squeaks of chalk on the chalkboard. It makes the reader go, oh, this class sounds kind of boring. You're just hearing time pass by. But you could also focus on the sound of a pen quickly tapping against someone's teeth, the classroom of people rapidly flipping through their textbooks when the teacher changes topics, or the deafening silence when the teacher asks a question. Now the atmosphere of the classroom is nervous and tense. Now luckily, visual novels also have visuals, so we don't need to just rely on prose to build up that atmosphere. Making visuals that reflects the tone of the stories just builds on that atmosphere and helps bring your reader into a state of mind that primes them to feel a certain way going into scenes. Let's say you have a fight between 2 swordsmen. If you wanted it to feel casual, like this is something these two do every day, maybe they'll fight in a field. You hear the low hum of insects in the grass and the rhythmic swipes of farmhands digging out rocks in the dirt, ignoring what's going on. You're primed into thinking this is a low-stakes fight, almost routine. But on the other hand, if we wanted to make this fight seem epic and final, you can have them fight on the edge of a cliff, in the middle of a burning forest, or with the chaos of a larger battle around them, where you can see the clear separation between life and death in the scenery itself. Most often though, you aren't necessarily using atmosphere to just prime readers for certain emotions, just to sort of invite them in your world. And the actual visual presentation, how you depict that world that you're creating, that makes a huge difference for how readers just come into your story. If you have a goofy, lighthearted story, then you want to use your art to build an atmosphere to let the reader know it's goofy and lighthearted from the get-go. For example, you can make colors bright and cheery instead of dark or moody. But if you still wanted a dark film noir look to everything, you could always make the style itself cartoony or change everyone into animals, like in the visual novel Chicken Police. Now it has that dark aesthetic, but the atmosphere still seems fairly lighthearted. Back to Spooktober, in The End Is Never the End, the devs wanted to create an off-putting, tense environment that keeps the reader on their toes. It does this by using a tight color palette to evoke a feeling of anxious intensity. This is a game where even when you're having a calm conversation, it's kinetic and twitchy. The atmosphere of this game really made it stand out. But sometimes trying to push the visual envelope can kind of lead to a common pitfall for these kinds of game jams. Lesson 3, maintain art cohesion. Nothing kills great art quite like when the different elements just don't gel. A common issue is when the sprites, background, and UI just look a little too disparate in terms of color, style, and theme. Now, practically, I know why this would happen. If you let your artists work separately and never let them see what each of them is working on, one artist is working on sprites, another is working on UI, and the last one is making backgrounds. When you put it all together, the odds of it working as a cohesive whole is pretty small. Usually you want to start game development with some rough sketches, concept work, and color treatments, so everyone knows roughly what they'll be designing around. Then you want to check their work over time, even in progress, to make sure that everything is keeping close to that original vision. The person looking over this stuff also needs to be a fairly good designer in their own right, because they'll be able to spot what needs to be changed or altered to make sure that all the pieces fit together, and express that in a way that your artist can understand and implement. Vague, imprecise directions will not help anybody. You need clarity, especially with a tight deadline. This also plays into how the assets actually get laid into the game, like making sure that the various elements are kind of aware of each other in the first place. My biggest pet peeve was the positioning of the text box. A few games were clearly designed with the sprites taking up the full page, but when the text box was placed, suddenly some really important parts of the character sprite got covered up. You need to make sure your artists know how the UI or other important story elements will be placed around their character. The Spooktober entry Model Employee took this to an extreme, where the UI was a central part of the storytelling. And even though the art was different in the style of sprites, UI, and backgrounds, the pieces fit together visually and thematically. Phantom of the Black Rose Review and Satan is an Astronaut were another two games with some really solid art direction from the start. Phantom of the Black Rose Review clearly draws from the 1970s shoujo manga, like Rosa Versailles by Ryoko Ikeda, and sticks to that influence pretty tightly. It keeps a black and white flowery look, with complete cohesion between the art and UI. Satan is an Astronaut also keeps a very particular color palette, so even when it swaps between the forested area inside of the ship's center and the colder interiors of the crew's living quarters, it all looks like it harmoniously comes together. Of course, it also helps that all of these were a joy to read from start to finish, which can't be said for every entry. Lesson 4. Edit, edit, edit. A lot of the visual novels we played kind of felt like first drafts, which is completely understandable. If you have a big idea in your mind and you're wearing a lot of different hats during development, a month might not be long enough to give them the sufficient polish that you'd normally give them. Some of the games had typos, grammatical errors, or in a few instances like clearly labeled placeholder text, like it said right here, like we'll put some fun text here. The solution to this though is kind of simple. Just don't make your games that long. Make your games shorter. Fans clearly prefer longer visual novels. It's more bang for your buck, and it's a big selling point for these games. That being said, This is a juried visual novel contest for free games, and we've got a lot of these to read through. Like seriously, it was a lot that we had to read in a very short amount of time. The judges are under a time constraint, and although we don't want to play a whole bunch of 5-minute mini games, we want the stories to feel satisfying, so most of the winning games tend to be from 20 to 40 minutes long to read. Any longer than that, and we found the writing quality generally tends to not be consistent throughout. There's a lot of padding and the pacing seems kind of plodding. This doesn't necessarily mean the writers are bad, it just means they bit off more than they could chew. A few devs wrote games that were 40 minutes to an hour long that really feel like it could have been cut down a lot. If a part of your game feels unpurposefully slow, feel free to cut it out. This ties a lot into lesson 1. It's totally fine to just cut out the beginning of your story and start your story where the action begins. Here's Bill Hader talking about Akira Kurosawa doing this for his film Stray Dogs.
Going back to Stray Dog, that's what Red Kurosawa, he basically said the ending of Act 1 was him losing his gun.
Right.
And this guy said, you should make that the first line of the movie.
Yeah.
Because now shit's happening. Everything was set up to him losing his gun. And let's find, it's the screenwriting 101, but this is in the 40s in Japan. It's like,
yeah.
Let's find out about him on the run as opposed to like this boring setup.
Model Employee was maybe half an hour to 40 minutes, and that was a great length, pacing out the story with a regular series of kills. So you knew whatever you were doing, someone would die soon. That's exciting. On the other hand, the final prize of Soup was closer to an hour, which can be a bit on the long side for this jam, but the dev did an amazing job separating the story into a series of mini arcs that changed the scenery regularly and made the whole game packed with variety. It was like a constant unfolding box with something new every 15 minutes or so, which is great. And that regular unfolding action is also something you can apply with your camera direction. Lesson 5, keep things moving visually. So ideally, something should be changing on the screen with every line of dialogue. Move the camera or sprites, change the character's expression, or anything that keeps the visual momentum going. It doesn't take a lot to give the reader a reason to look around the rest of the screen, and it can even enrich the narrative itself. But nothing can be draining quite like reading a visual novel and having no reason to ever look up from this little text box. Remember back in lesson 1, I complained about like how boring that first day of school thing is in visual novels? It's just the most boring thing, right? No, it shouldn't be. It should be really exciting. I played the 2023 release of MiHoYo, Witch on the Holy Night, and that first day of school narrative is actually pretty exciting when it's combined with these frequent camera movements and expression changes. I mean, seriously, look at that thing. Whoosh, whoosh. This is a very exciting scene happening, and I can assure you they are not talking about anything exciting. This is very boring dialogue, but it does not look it. I made a video previously that went over a lot of the techniques for camera direction, and another video on a Ren'Py tool that I personally like to use to achieve these camera directions, and explain what they can add to your narrative while keeping new art assets to a minimum. Shared Beauty was a Spooktober entry that did a great job keeping the camera moving, and doing a lot with mostly black silhouette sprites, minimalist backgrounds, and a couple of CGs. And if you're saying to yourself, oh gee, that seems like a lot of work. Yeah, it is. And so's the next lesson. And you should still do it. Lesson 6, test your game. A surprising number of entries, they just did not work. Either there were graphical errors or game-breaking bugs, or it was just like really, really hard to finish the game. Like mind-bogglingly difficult to understand how to finish the game. Whenever you make games for a jam, you always want to make sure that you include time for like a bug testing phase, no matter what. And unless you have a very experienced team, you probably don't want to try to figure out how to make some new features you've never made before. Juniper Tree is a really great example of how to make a game during a jam, because even though the walking mechanics were great, it was also something they've made before with their game The Last Star. Reusing and refining those mechanics in a game jam is a great strategy. Meanwhile, I do not know if Team Cedar City has messed around with the mechanics in Bury the Hatchet before. It doesn't quite play like their other games, but it still works fine and it runs bug-free, which is a hell of an accomplishment to do in a month. Before releasing your game at the end of a game jam, you should at least do these steps. And by at least, I mean do all of these steps. 1. Tap through your game from beginning to end and make sure it runs, like the whole way through. 2. Test through every choice option. If you have a lot of variables that affect those choices, you need to test for as many possibilities as you can to see if any of these break it. 3. Have someone else beta test it. If they get stuck somewhere or have any trouble getting through a section, you may need to make some adjustments. Once you found any bugs and fixed them, you gotta do these steps again to make sure you didn't break anything else. The more moving parts your game has, the greater the chances something could break. And the last lesson is probably the simplest one. Lesson 7, play more visual novels. Visual novels are a great option for beginning devs because if you keep them simple, they're basically just PowerPoint presentations. If you're an artist or writer with little game dev experience, it's easy enough to dive in with little to no programming experience. And if you're just starting as a game dev, this is an easy way to get an experimental game under your belt. Visual novels tend to attract a lot of developers who've never actually read visual novels before. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually pretty nice. It encourages people who've never played these sorts of games before to actually give them a shot and see what they can learn from other interesting games in the space. One thing to learn is, this is gonna sound really stupid. This is gonna sound really dumb. If you play enough visual novels, you'll learn that really good ones try to make it very easy to actually read your story. I mean, let users tap the mouse anywhere, press the space bar, or autoplay the story. These are not very complicated processes that you can kind of do while you're reclining in your chair. If you make the user have to click a small button in the lower part of the screen every time they want to advance, that's not going to make it very easy to continue the story. Now, this might not sound like that big of a deal for you, but imagine it from the perspective of a judge in this game jam where you play 20 visual novels in a row that all use the same exact controls and configurations. Now imagine we hit the first game that decides to switch it up and try a new control scheme. You're kind of off your rhythm. You have to adapt to that new control scheme, and if it is worse than all the rest, every line of dialogue is now fighting with the constant thought of, oh, this feels awful to have to press this button. Another big benefit to reading more visual novels is inspiration. And you really shouldn't be inspired by just the best of the best all the time. It's easy to call out a game for not being fun or even being bad, but it's another thing to read, digest, and really figure out why something did or did not work. YouTubers have made careers out of crapping on bad games, but as game devs, we don't have the luxury to simply label something bad and move on. We need to look at what makes visual novels succeed or fail and apply those lessons to our own games. And to learn one of the lessons I learned the hard way, you can watch this video right here, or subscribe, and I'll have a link to all the previous Spooktober game jams so you can go ahead and try out a whole bunch of those games too. It really is my favorite game jam.